强迫震荡和共振。当一个人自己荡秋千的时候啊，这是个自由震荡，你想怎么就怎么样。当有朋友周期性的推拉你这个秋千的时候，这是强迫震荡，你的震荡频率由不了你，由你的朋友决定。那就是有两种不同的角频率。自然角频率就是系统自由震荡的频率，外界强迫力的角频率就是欧米伽 d， 这个 d 在英文就 drive， 是人家推动力的欧米伽 d。强迫振子以强迫力的角频率震荡，那么它的位移 x 呢是这样，这看起来也正，但是这个频率不一样的，它是个强迫震荡这是震荡的正负。当外面的强迫震荡的角频率等于欧米伽时候你的跟你自己的自由震荡的频率一样的时候，这个振子的正负位移是最大，我们称为共振共振的话，我们可以利用它很多无形的，我们也要防备它。下面我们会讲都是双面刃所有的力学结构都有一个或者一个以上的自转频率。当外界的强迫力较大，并且频率与上面是自转频率一样的时候那么这个结构的震荡最终会破坏倒闭的。历史上有很多例子你看这是一个，你看这当你一个强迫频率跟震荡频率的时候，这个振子的震荡当然跟它阻力也有关系但是总是在这个时候下面我们看一个例子，真人真事。他们在1940年
By the mid-20th century, the suspension bridge had come into its own. But in November 1940, something happened that would change these bridges forever. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington State opened in July 1940 and hit instant fame. Christened Galloping Gertie, this newly opened bridge began to oscillate uncontrollably.
It's making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I think about it, because you just don't want to go there. You know, it's a horrible, horrible thing.
On the 7th of November 1940, Galloping Gertie collapsed. For designers, nothing would ever be the same again. The collapse of the Tacoma Narrows was a wake-up call for suspension bridge designers. In pursuit of slenderness, they'd underestimated the power of wind. The mystery lay in the fact that Tacoma was designed to withstand 120-mile-an-hour winds. Yet the wind speed on the 7th of November 1940 was only 40 miles per hour. The key to unlock this mystery would be found in a phenomenon called natural frequency.
Natural frequency is it would be something that's very familiar to anybody who likes music. It's the note that something makes. And if you pluck a guitar string or a violin string, you hear a note which has a particular frequency. And bridges are no different.
We've got three structures here. They've each got a different natural frequency. The natural frequency is the frequency it wants to vibrate at if you just give it a twang. And so we've got a really slow natural frequency here, got a really fast one, and we've got one in the middle.
In this test, the Tacoma Narrows natural frequency is most similar to the slow one. When winds hit a bridge, they create mini whirlwinds, called vortices. The problems start when these vortices have the same natural frequency as the bridge. This is called resonance.
If I now start to shape this support for these three bridges, if I do it really slowly, just give it a little motion, at the natural frequency of my big slow one, you can see that the big slow one really starts to respond, and we get massive amplification, and the other two are hardly doing anything. If I do it at intermediate sort of speed, the middle one goes wild and the other two stop. And if I go really fast, just a little one goes wild and the other two stop.
On that morning, with vortices created at the natural frequency of Galloping Gertie, it was only a matter of time before resonance caused the bridge's collapse. Tacoma terrified bridge engineers. Suddenly, wind was the enemy. They went back to the drawing board and discovered that the way to combat resonance was to bolt extra beams underneath the deck, called a stiffening truss. At vast expense, bridges around the world, including Golden Gate, were retrofitted. It seemed the stiffening truss was the only way forward. That was until the late 1950s, when a young British designer came up with a new idea. And after countless awards, more than 40 years later, Bill Brown still plays down his role.
I think I was probably at the right place at the right time, in fact.
The magic of Bill's idea was to work with the wind rather than against it.
I didn't know that it would work aerodynamically. I knew it would work structurally, but not whether the aerodynamics would work.
Bill came up with the idea of reshaping the deck of the suspension bridge to make it aerodynamic. The wind is deflected around it, and the deck flies in the wind. Bill had just finished the 4th road bridge and had won the commission to build a crossing over the River Severn. This would be the first bridge in the world to have this new deck. But first, he had to test it. 40 years later, Bill demonstrates what his wind tunnel tests showed. First up, he tests the Tacoma deck.
You can see the Tacoma Narrows section is twisting quite violently.
At just 40 miles per hour, the Tacoma deck cannot withstand the wind.
We now have mounted the 7 cross-section, and we're running this now at 150 miles an hour. As you can see, it is absolutely stable. This is because we have an aerodynamic section, the wind is flowing above and below it, streamlined, and the forces are low.
The Severn Suspension Bridge was opened in 1966 and would lead the way in modern bridges.
The magic is that it is streamlined, and therefore the wind forces are low, and there are very few vortices. So generally speaking, we don't need to add structural resistance to overcome the wind forces.
After the success of the Severn, bridges around the world were built with aerodynamic decks, starting with the Humber. Resisting wind and earthquakes is a challenge, but there are other forces of nature out to get the suspension bridge. Over the years, engineers thought they understood the effect of people walking on a bridge, but they didn't.
Down you two! Break step!
Everybody knows about the Roman army having to break step when they go across bridges. And the reason for that is because they march very regularly. You have lots of people all putting their feet down at the same time. And if you get a bridge which happens to have a frequency which is close to that, the Romans must have found out 2,000 years ago that if they didn't break step, they would actually knock the bridges down.
在飞机上，机械的它的自然频率不能跟等于引擎的频率，否则的话，它们共振，机械就会掉。1985年墨西哥大地震达到8.1级，它的频率呢是3个弧度每秒。那么许多中等高度的房屋的共振频率呢，大概53秒。所以呢，在共振的时候，它们大部分倒塌。比较矮的房子有比较大的共振频率，比较高的有比较低的共振，它们都安全无恙，就中等高度的频率，这就是共振啊。共振这么坏？不是的，共振有好的，比如说电视台、电台能接收，都是靠共振的。如果没有共振现象，很抱歉，你现在手机根本就不行。
This bowling ball pendulum will be used to demonstrate resonance. The pendulum swings with a natural frequency of about 1 swing every 2 seconds. We'll drive it by striking it with a rubber mallet. First, we'll drive the pendulum by striking it repeatedly at short intervals. Even after many blows, the pendulum isn't moving very far. But if we change the striking frequency to the natural frequency of the pendulum, the amplitude increases with each blow of the mallet.
这个球的振幅可以很大很大，这就是共振现象。
This physical pendulum drives a rocker bar, which in turn drives 3 simple pendula hanging from the bar. The driving frequency can be changed by moving a weight on the physical pendulum. The weight is first adjusted so that the driving frequency is equal to the natural frequency of the longest
这
pendulum.
个驱动频率啊，
If the 3 pendula
放在
are
这上面
initially
可以有联系
stationary,
的，有
only the longest pendulum
你
responds
就发现
strongly.
了，这个家伙跟他一头没2/3，我们讲过的啊，你们看看他看啊。
The weight is now adjusted so that the driving frequency matches the frequency of the middle pendulum. Notice the strong response of the middle pendulum and the different phase lags between the driver
这个
pendulum
这个
and
折的
each
最
of the
动，这
3
两个都不
simple
动
pendula.
啊，共振频里面。
This spring and weight hang from a driver
你看
whose
这个是
frequency
这有
can
一
be
个频率
adjusted with
啊
this control.
这个频率外加
We'll increase
控
the
制它
driving
调
frequency
节的，
slowly
跟它自
and
己的
watch
自
the
然频
effect
率
on the
有关
motion
系
of the
的。
weight. At low frequencies, the mass
频率
moves
很低
very
的时候，它
little.
基本上不振动了。然后把它频率调高，啊，这个频率是可以调整，通过它频率的。
As the frequency increases, the amplitude of oscillation increases until the mass strikes the table.
你看，
The
这
weight
个
is
频
now
振的
landing
话，
behind the
如
driver,
果跟它固有
which
频
is
率一样，
moving
它
at
振
the
动力很
resonant
大，这就是
frequency
共
of
振
the。spring and weight.
然后
When the frequency is increased further,
然后
the amplitude of
把这频
oscillation
率再增大的
decreases.
话，它又不共振了，所以它的震荡越来越小，越来越小。
We will demonstrate resonance by breaking a
我
glass
们有个声
beaker
波
with a，sound
把这个
wave.
玻璃
This beaker has
这
a
个杯
natural
啊，把它可以
oscillation which can be
共振，
produced
使
by
它消
gently
灭。
tapping its
啊
brim.
这个它有个共振频率，听到这个频率啊，
We
这是它
create
的
a
自然
resonance
频
by
率，我
exposing
们
the
可以听得
beaker
到，
to
在
a
我们
sound
可以
wave
听到
of the
频率范
same
围之内。
frequency.
然后我们
For
放一
this
个声波，
demonstration, we use
使
a
得频率
stable
跟它一样，
oscillator
它共振以后可以碎掉。
and a horn
通
driver
过这
which
个喇
can
叭
handle a large
让它才
amount
一个
of
声
power.
频。
The beaker is positioned on a foam rubber pedestal in front of the hole from which the sound emerges. The sound wave emitted by the vibrating beaker is picked up by the microphone to the left of the beaker and displayed on the oscilloscope.
这是个
The
频率
oscilloscope
啊，
is
这是
triggered by the signal from the oscillator, but displays the signal emitted by the beaker, so that both the amplitude increase and the phase shift can be observed as the frequency is tuned through resonance. The frequency of the oscillator has now been set to the natural frequency of the
好，
beaker.
别人的频率
Using
调的跟它的
oscilloscope,
自然频率一
the
样，
oscillations
你就
of
发
the
现它
brim
慢
of the
慢的，
beaker
哎，
can be viewed from
你发现
above.
它在震荡嘛，这个杯子有大小会在变化，也在震荡。到了一定的时候，它就会破掉，它受不了了，振幅一大有的破
Returning
不
to
了。
a front view of the beaker, we now increase the amplitude of the sound
把
wave
这个
until
能
the
量
oscillation
大，
of the
输出能量
beaker
大一点，
exceeds its
使它
elastic
给
limit.
它大一点能量，它就破掉。
This pair of physical pendula have the same period. If we connect the pendulum together with the light spring and set one in motion, the second pendulum also begins to move.
我们看呢，我们把一个振动，他们可以通过这个弹簧传给它，啊，这个频率是这个频率，跟它一样，最后我们就发现它的振幅很大。最后
Soon
它可以
both
把能
pendula
量
have nearly equal
分给它
motions.
均衡，然后很奇怪，他把所有能量都给他，他不懂，他懂，
Now the second pendulum has all the energy and the first pendulum has nearly stopped.
对不对？然后的话，他又把他能量传给他，哎，这很有意思。
The energy has now gone full cycle, with the first pendulum in full motion and the second at rest. If we connect the two pendula with a stiffer spring, the energy is exchanged much more quickly.
如果我们用不同的强度的弹簧系统来连接，那么它的传递的速度可以快慢的。你看这个弹簧比较厉害，很快就传给它了。
If we change the period of one of the pendula by moving a weight, the energy no longer passes
但是
completely
如果我
from
们把它
one
们
pendulum
共
to
振
the
的频
other.
率改掉，你就会发现的话，它就不能传能量。
Here is a device called a Wilberforce
这有一个
pendulum.
旋转，还有一个
It
上
can
下，
oscillate in two ways,
这两个能量可以相互
vertically
振动。
and back and forth in torsional oscillation. After the pendulum is made to oscillate vertically, energy begins to transfer into torsional oscillation and the pendulum begins to twist.
这个振动比较越来越小，就变成它的转动。
After a while, most of the energy of the pendulum is in torsional
不振
oscillation.
动了，就变成
The
旋
pendulum is
转。
barely moving in the vertical direction.
这个能量可以转换成为它振动。你看的啊。
Then energy begins to transfer back into vertical
现在能量慢
oscillations.
慢的转回去，你看它又开始
Eventually,
振动
nearly all the energy is in the vertical oscillations, and the cycle begins again.
.不转动了，全部变成正当能量。